One Step Ahead by Lundquist and Beslick.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night, depending on where you are. This is One Step Ahead Radio, one and only global sustainability and ESG update on what is going on in the world. This week, some very interesting developments. Some would call it even a breaking news. It's coming out of the US, and it's the second month in a row that renewable energy is producing far more energy for United States of America than coal is doing. It's going to be interesting to follow this, especially in relation to debate in the upcoming US elections and how this will be used by various parties to emphasize the importance of transition towards more sustainable energy resources. This week, we have plenty of interesting things to discuss. One of them is, of course, the latest research done by Financial Times on the big tech giants around the world, and they're reporting on CO2 emissions, or basically not just reporting on CO2 emissions, I would say, but the story and narrative and the calculations behind that FT was scrutinizing. Very interesting piece. I will also bring in James Osborne from Lundquist to discuss a bit about his view on what is going on. Of course, a couple of other news coming out this week across the world is that US is actually investing right now more in climate tech than China is doing. It is a significant step forward for US. I think it's, of course, related to Inflation Reduction Act during the Biden administration. So far, fintech companies, clean tech companies in the US have been basically gathering about $9 billion in the investments, which is almost the double of what has been happening in the China. Now, all of us maybe like ketchup or not, but it is an interesting piece on Heinz ketchup in the world and what the heat means for production of tomatoes that are used for it, and how the industry, especially in the US and California, where the Heinz ketchup is grown, are doing genetic modification of the plants and tomatoes in order to sustain the heat, increase of the heat in this part of the world. And this is not only going to happen in US, of course, it's going to happen in other parts of the world, along with discussion that we are going to have now, which is a very important discussion, and that is the discussion on how the tech giants are trying to mislead some of the reporting related to their CO2 emissions. Of course, when you read, which I do and many others are doing following this, working with this, maybe people who don't work with this have difficulties to actually look at the numbers and really try to understand them, and that's completely understandable. It's not easy even for those who actually work with this. If you look, for instance, in a social media group, Meta, which I think runs Facebook, it says it has already hit net zero emissions in its energy use, which is quite interesting. But FT analysis of its 2023 sustainability report showed that its real world CO2 emissions from power consumption prior were calculated at 3.9 million tons compared to 273 net tons cited in the report. So there is tricking with the numbers. And what is also important to stress is that these tech giants are basically posed to become some of the biggest energy users of the future, as the race to develop power-hungry artificial intelligence, we know, potentially threatening their commitments to net zero. Ahead of that, many of these giants are working behind the scenes to shape once in a decade rewrite of the rules governing how pollution from power use is disclosed. This is a very important piece. And this discussion is taking place in the European Union, and is also taking place in some other parts of the world. Companies including Amazon, Meta, Google have founded and lobbied the Green Gas Protocol, the carbon accounting oversight body, and finance research that helps back up their position, according to the document seen by FT. Now, when we talk about that, James, I would like to cue into this conversation and ask you a bit of a question. You've been in this space for a long time. Before maybe starting that, maybe good for people to understand a bit who you are, where you come from, and also what you're doing, why this is important. Yeah, please, James, welcome.
Yeah, hi, Sasha. Thanks for the introduction. Yeah, well, at Lundquist, we're really kind of trying to help guide companies through these kinds of issues and problems. So many consultants is working in sustainability, working in very vertical sort of specific areas, or just looking at reporting, or just looking at sort of carbon accounting and aspects like that. And what we're trying to do is kind of join up all the dots between strategy, business transformation, and then the sort of the communications and the delivery and the reporting on that. It needs to make sense to people. It needs to have that kind of clarity of where the business is going and how it's going to create value for all the stakeholders and shareholders. So that's why also our collaboration, our partnership with you is so fundamental, to bring that extra perspective from the market and your experience to sort of help companies. Because, with news like this, it's understandable that they can get disconcerted, and they can get confused and say, oh, we always thought that, that was, the gold standard of how we're going to talk about our net zero strategy. And so it's important.
Thank you, James. I'm really puzzled with this, because we are using the services software and the service, and in many cases on a daily basis from these companies, and we know that the energy consumption will increase. Now, fiddling with the numbers is one thing, but how easy is it actually for the end client to understand what companies are communicating on sort of a CO2 emissions and climate? What's your experience in that space?
Well, I think it's interesting, this story, because there's such huge global brands apart from just being companies, and a lot of companies, the kind of companies we're working with and we talk to, when they're dealing this at a kind of strategic level, they're really looking for that they're doing the right thing, that they're making an impact. And they're also under a lot of pressure to have this kind of reach these kind of net zero aligned goals. And so we've seen a lot of companies, signing up to SBTI, the Science Based Targets Initiative, as kind of being seen as the gold standard in terms of having decarbonization plans. But then if it's being undermined and people say, well, is net zero really net zero? What do you mean by that? There's this whole greenwashing accusation. So companies feel, I'm damned if I don't, and I'm damned if I do. And they feel a bit kind of vulnerable, because investors are always pressing them, saying, well, where's your decarbonization strategy? Where are you going to be? Consumers are saying, oh, I like to see a nice, clear, simple, like black and white label, but underneath it's much more complex and changing. The lobbying thing is quite concerning.
What's fascinating for me, when we go back in a couple of years, and looking at the way how corporates have been communicating these targets and these commitments, they've been quite generous in communicating them straight out, without even thinking about complexity of reaching them. Of course, counting on that the economy and the energy system will transform, which is something that we are witnessing right now is not really happening in the scale and in the speed that we would like it to be. In your view, do you think that companies also need to sort of explain and focus a bit more on how complex this is? Because that's not really what they're trying to do. What they're trying to do is to say that we get this, we understand this, we're going to make it. You as a client, you can feel comfortable that we are doing it. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think more and more people, as we move forward, understand that it's not a simple path, it's not an easy path, and it's not. There's no simple solutions to these kind of complex sustainability issues. So I think having that kind of a narrative helps build trust, above all with more professional stakeholders and business stakeholders and your own employees. People on the front line who actually know and work with these kind of issues. So you can't be, there's a lot of suspicion about companies just being very superficial and putting out sort of high-level messages that says, yeah, of course we're on top of it and don't worry. So that's really cool. And I think there's also, when companies come out and be more vocal, I think it's really important to be more transparent at the same time. That kind of advocacy piece really needs to be supported by, I've been looking at various initiatives recently that are tracking lobbying. You talked about the tech giants lobbying around carbon accounting. And I think, it's interesting that there's that view on how well that's done and how companies are actually being clear about that.
But in terms of lobbying, I mean, is this something this has been going on? And we know this. I mean, both any industry. I mean, the Brussels and European Union is full of lobbyists for various kinds of industries. Is this something that you think will grow in terms of the transparency going forward? That companies will need to be a bit more clear about what they lobby and who they lobby?
The lobbying issues is going to be really huge, and I think industry associations need to be much more transparent as well on this, because that's where a lot of the we know from the oil and gas work on lobbying on climate policy over many years. Obscure industry associations really need to be sort of pulled out a bit more into the open. What are the car companies saying publicly compared to what they say behind closed doors is a really important issue around what they're trying to achieve.
Yeah. Thanks, James. I mean, there is one more thing that I would like to discuss and have your view on. I mean, you have seen that one of the additional bank, the one that is very famous and very influential around the world, called Goldman Sachs, has withdrawn from the yet another a big one, climate top 100, sort of a list of the companies around the world supporting that. This is almost like a train coming out of the US, where the big US banks and institutions are leaving many of these climate commitments around the world, claiming in many cases that this will potentially have a legal impact on them, because in the US there are, of course, a number of states where the Republicans in particular are claiming that many of these activities where sustainability or other type of issues that are related to taking care of fiduciary duty related to climate change are anti-American, which is something that is indeed troublesome, because you have to bear in mind that the transition towards sustainable future needs to be underpinned by climate capital flows or inflows into the sectors that are really necessary, where the transition is really necessary. This is again creating a bit of a question in the financial industry across the world, if this pushback on sustainability and the pushback on ESG type of investments in general is going to spread to another part of the world. As you probably know, in European Union, that's probably very low risk on that, because the ESG disclosure, at least in European Union, is legally binding for financial institutions. In many other parts of the world, it's not. Japan, where I'm currently working, is one of the countries that is viewing voluntary principles and changing its own sort of a perspective and ways how to do this, looking at European Union and also US. Now, when we talk about the big banks and we talk about the responsibility on sustainability versus ESG sort of a type of investments, it's still obvious that fossil fuel investments around the world are increasing, and are increasing at the pace that was not expected, given commitments made in Paris and given commitments made by these banks a couple of years ago. There is a lot of research out there. The big question is, do people really, on a sort of a citizen level across the world, European Union, US, Asia, understand the consequences of further sort of exploration of oil and gas across the world? Looking at the Japanese economy, which is very heavy dependent on fossil fuels, there is a target from government to do significant investments in renewable energy. However, looking at the numbers, many of these investments are still very small, nascent, and not really picking up the scale where they should be. Going back to the people that are listening, as I mentioned earlier, there are a couple of things always to follow. What is going on in China? What is going on in the US? What are the energy sort of trends in the world that are pointing us into the right direction? And I think one of them is, of course, related to current situation regarding the heat in the world. There is research that has been done by and published a couple of days ago by different sources, claiming that July was the hottest 2024 month ever met in the world, in the history of humankind. As long as these measurements have been taken, it's by NASA. The other one was Copernicus Institute. There are different ways of measuring that. However, However, it's quite clear that the heat is probably here to stay in many parts of the world. And nowadays, there is a lot of discussion about how this will impact the capacity of the economies to sustain, especially in Southeast Asia, which is the production hub, supply chain hub to the rest of the consuming world, including Europe and the US. It's a big topic, something that we can address going forward. James, I know that you are still listening. Thank you very much for participation and giving your view this week at One Step Ahead Radio. Please join us in next week. We will continue sending at the same time, same day, every week, and hopefully we will provide you with more insights and more information that you can bring forward in whatever you do in your daily work. Thank you very much, and I wish you a great weekend and very, very non-heated such. Thank you.